They're becoming more overt, displaying their status and their wealth, particularly use social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram, and then we see them on there with their flash cars and their, well-made-up girlfriends. They tend to have people well-placed in certain areas as well to assist them, and we've seen some recent discussions around trusted insiders, particularly within freight and logistics. It could be your next-door neighbour, could be anywhere.
Welcome back to the Mafia's Web. If you've been with us for all 8 episodes, thanks for listening. If this is the first episode you're listening to, then you've picked the right one. We've saved the best until last. I'm Stephen Drill. I've been investigating the Mafia for the past 2 years while I was working as a correspondent in Europe. I travelled around Italy and I spoke to the people who were working to crack down on the Mafia. Since I've returned to Australia, I've done the same here. I've spoken to the people at the top of the AFP and the people in the know about what's happening here with the Mafia. The question I've repeatedly asked in this podcast is, how do you stop the Mafia? It's not an easy question to answer. And like coronavirus, we're probably just going to have to live with it forever. That is, unless everyone in the world gets a vaccine and everyone in the world stops taking cocaine and party pills. Unfortunately, neither is realistically going to happen. But there has been a major breakthrough.
Today, the Australian government, as part of a global operation, has struck a heavy blow against organised crime, not just in this country, but one that will echo around organised crime around the world. This is a watershed moment in Australian law enforcement history.
This week, law enforcement agencies in more than 30 countries pulled off one of the most audacious stings in living memory. In anybody's language, it was brilliant crime fighting. Here in Australia, it was called Operation Ironside. 4,500 AFP officers were involved, 224 people were charged, 525 offences.
The figures are impressive. More than 12,000 encrypted devices used by more than 300 criminal syndicates operating in more than 100 countries. More than 27 million messages obtained and reviewed over 18 months.
The Australian Federal Police, the FBI, Europol, and authorities across the globe pulled off the sting of the century. They secretly monitored messages sent on the Anom app, a supposedly encrypted messaging service that was promoted by crooks all around the world. But the AFP and the FBI had put a bug in the software that tracked every message. Users across the world spoke freely, even of their plans to murder rivals, which led to police averting at least 20 assassinations. This unprecedented dump of information has given police the clearest picture they have ever had of how the Mafia operates and how it links with other groups. It all dropped in June 2021. And we will be reading about it for years to come as police sift through all that information. AFP Acting Assistant Commissioner Todd Hunter was one of the many officers around the world involved in Operation Ironside. That was the code name it was given in Australia.
It was one particular encrypted device platform. There are several others that are in use in organised crime environments, but it did shine a light on organised crime here in Australia and gave us some great insights. It gave us some great intelligence, and it's allowing us to map out those members of criminal organisations across Australia and across the world impacting on Australia. And we're methodically working through those. And, we've already seen the arrests that we've made so far, both here in Australia and internationally. We're continuing to do our work on all of that, and there's more arrests coming.
AC Hunter is not one to blow his own trumpet. If I was the AFP, I wouldn't want to appear to dance on the grave of the Mafia because that just might encourage them. But AC Hunter does concede it was a big win.
It's a watershed moment for the AFP, and I'm so proud of all of our members that participated and contributed and helped improved the safety and livelihoods of many, many Australians as a result.
For the AFP and the FBI, the Anom app was like Charlie getting a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. They were listening in real time to crooks plying their trade. It's comparable with the British mathematicians at Bletchley Park in England decoding the German Enigma machine during World War II. They knew everything, but they had to be careful not to blow the secret. If they foiled too many plans, the crooks would know that something was up. A similar calculation was made by the British in that bloody World War. But AC Hunter says police drew the line at murders while still keeping the app a very tight secret.
I was involved quite early, knew about it quite early, and directed a number of teams' activities. Obviously, before that 8th of June day where we went large and public, we'd done quite a few activities associated with the intelligence that we were gaining, including preventing a number of murders and deaths.
In one of the many press releases sent out following Operation Ironside, the mafia was put at the top of the criminal tree in Australia. The order went: the Australian-based Italian mafia, bikie gangs, Asian crime syndicates, and Albanian organised crime groups were caught in the net. The wording and that order would have been well considered. More information will emerge about the mafia in the coming months, but the Anom app shows a shift in how the mafia works, and it highlights the tensions between the old school, low-profile Calabrian mafia bosses in Australia and their flashy, showy, younger generation who just can't help posting a selfie.
Certainly that's seen a trend. The senior mafia figures or Ndrangheta members, they, as we said before, traditionally display a low profile, but the younger generation have of course shifted that behaviour. They're becoming more overt, displaying their status and their wealth, particularly use social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram, and then we see them on there with their flash cars and their well made up girlfriends and those sort of things, and that's been the shift in that younger generation, as it has from many of the other criminal organisations and criminal groups. We see the younger ones involved in displaying their activities more openly.
Some of their cars cost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And we see them with their Maseratis and their flash girlfriends, and away we go. So.
And if you have a car like that, it's tempting to cut some laps.
Like everybody, they enjoy the odd opportunity to let their hair down and get out amongst it. And, they've got to go down to Lygon Street when it opens back up, and you'll see, I'm sure, examples of it.
For the young flash mafioso in Australia, they live their lives on social media, or at least their girlfriends do, and the police have been watching. It's a stark contrast to the older crew. There were those grass castles in Griffith, which we heard about in earlier episodes. They were the big houses bought with drug money. But if building a big house was bad, driving a Lamborghini down Lygon Street is not the smartest way to avoid police attention.
Traditionally, the Ndrangheta in particular and Italian organised crime, their method of operation in the past has been going under the radar. They stick to themselves, they didn't pop their heads up, and they worked regular jobs, drive regular vehicles, live in middle-class suburbs, so very much under the radar.
So the modest homes in the middle ring suburbs, with tomatoes growing in the backyard and homemade grappa in the shed, have been replaced with posh homes in Sydney's stylish suburbs. And the method of communicating has switched from face-to-face family events to what they now realise is the much more vulnerable encrypted apps.
We see traditionally in Italy, they attend religious events and meet to discuss matters. In Australia, they use business events and events such as weddings and funerals to talk about their criminal activities, so they're very much under the radar. They tend to have people well placed in certain areas as well to assist them, and we've seen some recent discussions around trusted insiders, particularly within freight and logistics arenas, where Italian organised crime seems to permeate quite prolifically.
Trusted insiders. That's a cop term for a mole. They are the people who work for the airlines, truck companies, and freight forwarding firms who are actually picking up two paychecks. One from their bosses and one from the mafia or other organised crime groups. There have been almost 30 people arrested following the Anom app sting. Police are going to allege that they are the blood that runs through the veins of Australia's drug trade. It's one thing to bring in tons of drugs into Australia in a shipping container. It's another thing to get it onto trucks and out to the drug dealers in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide. Most of the time, companies have no idea that they are employing crooks. These trusted insiders' motivations can be varied. They may have a drug problem, a gambling debt, a family connection, or they may just be greedy. But they contribute to the misery wrought by drugs in Australia, and the mafia is the web that draws it all together.
They've always had a presence in Australia, but probably over the last 10 years, we've seen that activity increase, and it's probably as a result of what I was just talking about, that they've had to adapt to their working environment and work with other criminal syndicates who don't employ the same operational security, I suppose, in our context, to their activities. And that's brought them into the light and has specifically identified the level of activity across Australia and that criminal environment. This is in contrast to how they were previously when they were heavily reliant on their traditional partners, such as the South American cartels and within each other, the closed circles that they had. So that's been the major change in identifying their activities in more recent years.
The mafia in Australia is not a new phenomenon, and like Roman and Anna Sergi told us previously, they had strong links to organised crime in Italy, sometimes right down to ordering and sanctioning crime in Australia. AC Hunter confirmed that pattern.
Traditionally, you call it the mafia. There's probably Italian organised crime we could refer to them as, and a section of those are what we would call the old school or the traditional 'ndrangheta, which are, your links back to Italy, crime families and so on. Traditionally, they've been involved in things like extortion, murder, cannabis cultivation and trafficking. That's in the past. And what we've seen through the evolution of their activities, increased migration, particularly in the 60s, they've developed and evolved. They had their footholds in those environments, but they've changed in that 20 years. They would have traditionally been much more insular and less trusting of other criminal syndicates or other persons. And they largely relied on each other, and only syndicate members would deal with so a closed circle, if you like.
But the mafia is changing because of increased competition. They have adapted, spinning their web in new areas. The links have changed from the family ties to industrial-scale crime. But there is one constant: cash is king.
Today we see mafia groups or Italian organised crime groups, they're more prone to working with other criminal syndicates from different ethnic backgrounds or different criminal groupings. So we see them working with outland motorcycle gangs, we see them working with South American cartels, we see them working with Middle Eastern organised crime units. So they've had to evolve and adapt to the criminal environment to be successful. It's a profit game. Organised crime is a profit game, and so they need to maintain relevance and competition, and that's forced them to work with these other criminal groups to try and maintain their profit margins and so on. So that's the biggest change, mostly that we've seen in that organised crime environment over recent years.
The change has been led by the younger generation of mafia, and while their fathers found flying under the radar was the best policy, the social media generation may be able to justify their flash cars bought with fast cash. You see, the millennial mafia peacock on social media to prove their power. They want to show other criminal groups they have the spoils of their enterprises.
The younger generation, they've adopted that that business model of working across organised crime entities and other groups as well. So, they have to, in some respects, they try and generate some credibility in their criminal environments through those platforms as well.
That collaboration between the mafia and bikie gangs has become so close, there are now some criminals who are members of both. For them, it's a case of can't beat them, join them. And the bikies' distribution links, particularly through the trucking industry, make the outlaw gangs necessary bedfellows.
If you have a look at their alignment with, say, outlaw motorcycle gangs, and we see some Italian organised crime members are also OMCG members or have affiliations or alignment with OMCGs, and that's very much about garnering trusts, being loyal, those sort of environments, and you don't get anywhere in business with OMCGs unless you've got that.
But once they've got the money, what does the mafia do with it? In Italy, they played the long game, spent the money on resorts and other businesses to provide a cash stream to muddy the waters. One of the world's biggest mafia bosses, Al Capone, he spent time in jail for carrying a deadly weapon in 1929, but his longest prison sentence was for tax evasion, not the murder and mayhem he was accused of leading in Chicago during America's Prohibition era. Australian mafia bosses know that they must have a paper trail to account for at least some of their income.
Stephen, they've always diversified and diverted their illegitimate funds into other legitimate business enterprise or business activities, the building industry, restaurants, cafes, transport companies, etc. And their methodology has been to run those legitimate businesses alongside their criminal enterprises, mostly cash-producing businesses, which we see, and that's so that they can launder their money or at least muddy the waters, so to speak.
But it's these links with legitimate businesses that make the mafia so dangerous. They can buy respectability and use the businesses to donate to political parties. And sometimes the real businesses make real profits, and they can then plough that back into major drug importations, and the circle completes itself.
So they utilise those legitimate funds to then provide them with a solid base to commit their other criminal activity. We've seen their involvement in the large-scale cultivation and trafficking of cannabis, for instance, particularly in South Australia and New South Wales, and that's then led to investments of the profits from those into other border-controlled drugs, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine importations as well. So that muddying the waters, or the inclusion of illicit funds with legitimate funds, that just makes it difficult for law enforcement to track their wealth and seize their assets, which is a key goal for us.
Those legitimate businesses, their footholds in the straight world, are also a weakness. The AFP puts in a huge effort to follow the money. Freezing assets like the family home, or perhaps the car or boat, can almost be as stinging as a prison sentence for a mafia boss.
And there's no doubt that much of that wealth has been transferred into legitimate businesses and assets over time. Whilst it's difficult, it's not impossible, and we've got some pretty well skilled members that we work with and that work on tracking assets and doing financial analysis and so on, and that expertise is backed by the proceeds of crime legislation that we have in Australia, which is both civil and criminal, and so that provides us with some good resources and some good tools to track these funds over time.
Crime author Keith Moore told us about the demand for drugs in Australia in an earlier episode. He revealed how pill-popping partygoers just pay more in Australia than people do in Europe and America. AC Hunter also confirmed that Australians were willing to pay top dollar for drugs, even during the coronavirus pandemic when nightclubs and pubs have been restricted. So people don't even need to head out to a pub or a dance party to snort lines of coke. It's so endemic in our society. For too many people, it's like having a knockoff beer on a Friday night.
Yeah, we didn't see a huge reduction in demand. There's probably, people are ingenious, and if they want their drugs, they'll go and get their drugs. And unfortunately, in Australia, Australian consumers are prepared to pay large amounts for their drugs, well in advance of any other countries, particularly in Europe and the US. We didn't see really any drop in demand, really.
Australia's closed borders for air travel did disrupt some supply. The drug mules are no longer carrying marijuana in their bodyboard bags or cocaine in their headphones in their luggage. But the mafia just switched routes.
We did see some impacts in supply, which has driven the prices up. Mostly, because the aviation sector, we didn't have the traditional normal flow of people through airports internationally, and that's quite a large segment of the supply chain for drugs. People carrying drugs in their bags and concealed on their persons and so on. So that element of the supply environment reduced significantly. But then we did see on the flip side of that increases in particularly the maritime space, so larger seizures in container shipments, and also the mail environment, much more coming in smaller amounts but more frequent amounts through the mail environment.
One of the biggest impacts this year has been that Trojan horse. The decoding of the Anom app as part of Operation Ironside has seen a major drop in supply, and in turn, a doubling of the wholesale price of cocaine.
Look, but the prices vary depending on quality and things like that, but we have seen prices jump during the pandemic, and after things like our major Operation Ironside, we've seen prices double, as I said before. So, in the AFP, we deal mainly in kilos and multiple hundreds of kilos most of the time. We work very closely with our state and territory partners on those smaller street level issues, but we try and get the supply chain matters out of the way first, so we've seen sort of jumps from 80 to 100,000 a kilo for meth, up to the 150 to 300 a kilo. Same with cocaine. So 50% jumps in prices up from. And the profit margins in all of that is quite astounding, and it goes to the comments that I made earlier that Australian drug users pay inordinate amounts for their drugs. We see criminal syndicates can buy, say, a kilo of cocaine delivered to Central America for $5,000 to $10,000 a kilo, and then they're selling it for upwards of $200,000 to $300,000 a kilo here in Australia. So it's a pretty huge profit margin that these criminals are reaping at the expense of our community.
But hang on, the mafia get caught and prices go up, so they are still making major money. But the benefits to the community are remarkable. What the pill-popping, blow-snorting set don't acknowledge is the social and environmental harm done by drugs. Users will often wave away their impact on society, saying alcohol does more damage. Well, to a point, they're right. But that's only because nearly everyone in society drinks alcohol, so the numbers are higher. But no one I know drink drives anymore. In the past, people did it every week, well, as long as they could get their keys into the ignition. But now, plenty of people drive while on drugs.
We know here in Victoria, for instance, that for every 2 kilograms of heroin used in the state of Victoria, there's a death. For every 2 kilograms of methamphetamine used, there is emergency medical treatment required, so an ambulance turning up or hospitalisation, etc. And that has a huge toll on the community, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. We're not even talking about, road trauma that's caused by drugs and people that are under the influence of drugs. You only got to see the horrific accident with the death of those 4 Victorian police officers. The truck driver under the influence of drugs. Those sort of things. The impacts on the community are just devastating on an ongoing basis. And then you overlay that with the murders and the criminal organisation wars and the innocent people that get caught up in those.
Hypocrisy is inevitable in life. But there's no bigger hypocrites than the middle-class drug user movement. In the UK, there's a phenomenon called woke coke, where users pay more for, quote, ethically sourced cocaine, unquote. It's like they're buying kombucha from Whole Foods. AC Hunter says the environmental impacts of drug use are sadly overlooked. Jungles are cut down in Asia for saffron oil, a key ingredient in MDMA or ecstasy.
We quite often the debate around, say, MDMA or ecstasy pops up for the party scenes and things like that, and that's, traditionally those people are the same people that are out there protesting around, the environment and things like that. But I don't know that there's much recognition of what it takes to actually manufacture the drugs that they're buying and taking. The trees being chopped down for saffron oil manufacture, devastating the jungle environments of places like Cambodia and Burma, etc., and Myanmar. Devastating effects on the environment, and they're the things that they're out there sometimes protesting about.
The mafia is down on the canvas, and if it was a boxing match, the AFP has the referee counting to 10. But the organised crime group will get up again to fight another day. They are just too entrenched in society, and they have been for decades. We're about to finish up the podcast, but I wanted to share a personal anecdote. My grandmother used to translate documents for the mafia. Well, she did until she found out they were criminals. I never met her, but I'm told she used to read the mail for a mafia figure who was well known in the Melbourne wholesale fruit market. The mafia figure went to St Monica's Catholic Church in Many Ponds, where my grandmother went, and many mafia bosses have been buried. He seemed like a normal bloke to her, and she was happy to help out her neighbour. That was until she translated a court appearance letter for him and saw him on the news. But that's the mafia. They hide in plain sight.
It could be your next door neighbour. Italian organised crime in Australia is mostly restricted to, the sort of the southeast environments. We see sort of pockets of them tied with the legitimate, normal, honest, everyday Italians as well, and we have those large communities, South Australia, New South Wales in particular, here in Victoria and in the ACT, and also in West Australia, less so in places like Queensland and the Northern Territory, although there is a population of Italians up in the far north of Queensland. Mostly traditionally been involved in farming in the old days when it was happening in Australia, tobacco production and so on. Yes, it can be anywhere. The Italian population since the 60s and migration has grown substantially, so elements of it, organised crime within that community has grown to similar proportions. It could be next door, could be anywhere.
It's been a long 2 years since I started investigating the mafia. I've learned a lot. This investigation has brought me into the lives of former dons. I've spoken to an undercover cop who put bosses behind bars. I met the people who grew up next door to the Ndrangheta and then gone on to become mafia experts. I also spoke to one of the cops who was part of the biggest sting of the century, and we learned firsthand what it's like to be in the mafia from someone who turned against them. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and maybe, in time, we can break the mafia's web. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. This podcast was hosted by me, Stephen Drill, and produced by Andrea Teese-Evanson. Please follow and subscribe to this podcast on whatever app you are listening through, and leave a rating and review if you can to help spread the word.